Hello, and welcome to TV Toastmasters. My name is JD Chandler. I'll be your host for this segment that I like to call Writers Readers, where I talk with authors about their books, the writing process, Portland history, and my new book, Portland Rogues Gallery, out now from Fonthill Media. Today joining me is Phil Stanford, the author of Portland Confidential, Rose City Vice, and many other books about Portland, my hero from Portland writing. I've been reading you for a long time, Phil, since you were doing your column in the Oregonian. And today, this time, we're going to be talking about my book, Portland Rogues Gallery, which is out now from Fonthill Media. And before we get started, I know you've got some questions for me, Phil, but before we get started, I want to say you're to blame for this book. You read a blog post of mine, the one about John Giles, or Jack Giles. He goes by different names, but the guy who went to jail and escaped and ended up being the Western writer. It's a fun story, and you said, you've got to write a book like this. And then you gave me Willie Nelson's rap sheet. So I had to do this, and it's all your fault. So what do you have for me, Phil?
Well, I'm happy to take the blame if that's what it is. It's a good book. I've read it. And what you neglected to say, the subtitle is A Baker's Dozen, right?
Yes.
That's 13,
yep.
13 stories. How did you pick them?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it was obvious I was going to do John Giles because he was like the centerpiece of the book. And then Willie Nelson, of course, had to be in there because you'd done such a good job kind of telling who he was in Rose City Vice, and then you gave me his rap sheet and some of his probation records. And so I had a lot of information. But really, the way I picked these characters, 13 of them, actually, it's a few more than 13 because there's one, there were partners and there were a couple.
Oh, yeah, it's actually many more than 13. Yeah. And in fact, taken in all, it's a pretty good survey of 200 years of nastiness in Portland.
Well, thank you. That's exactly what I was trying to do. And I did find, as I was going, I found, wow, I've kind of chronicled the history of armed robbery on the West Coast, basically, and also the drug business. I kind of follow the trends in the drug business, including the introduction of heroin to Portland, which is a pretty interesting story, I think. But I picked the characters because they were stories I wanted to tell. Jim LePayas, the first police chief, is somebody that I've always been fascinated with, and I wanted to get to the root of some of these stories. So yeah, it was based on stories that I wanted to tell or I needed to tell, maybe.
The story about Willie Nelson is besides the fact that he's, of course, interesting. I mean, I wrote some about him myself, and I was fascinated too. But he's in a way he's a low-level thug.
Yeah.
He's not like Lappius, who was a high-level thug.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I enjoy Lappius too because he was obviously a crook.
Yeah. And
he was the first marshal here. He had a saloon with alcohol, prostitution, and gambling.
Exactly.
But it is a continuous line in a way to Willie Nelson too, who was a figure in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And into the 80s, my God.
Yeah. Well, the thing that fascinated me about Willie Nelson is, like you say, he's a really interesting character. But what's most interesting about him is what he was able to get away with. And so I was really interested in why. Why did this guy manage to get away with so much? And it fits in so much with what I'd learned already about the rise of the crime syndicate in Portland in the 20s and 30s and their co-optation of the teenage athletic programs to recruit into their organization. And to me, Willie Nelson is like the epitome of that. Like you say, he was working with the police really early. And so most of his career, even when he was one of the biggest drug dealers in town, he was working with the police. your characters Deppie and Gerhardt that you talk about in Rose City Vice were using him to take over part of the methamphetamine trade. And so it was interesting. And the fact that I had some of his probation records showed that I had a cleaned up version of what he was doing in the 70s, what he was telling his probation officer. And I could put it together with things that I had found other places and see what the real truth was. So it was a real interesting story to write. And I'm really glad I got a chance to do it.
And one of the great aspects of his story is how he died.
Yes. Oh, yes. And that's where I first met
gravity boots.
Yes.
Yeah, you ought to, you know, you're selling books here. You ought to give people a teaser on that one anyway.
Yeah, well, Willie Nelson eventually died. He was killed by someone, shot to death while he was hanging upside down in a pair of gravity boots doing his workout. And that's where I first met him. I thought it was really interesting when I went back and looked at it, because the Oregonian even got his name wrong when they told the story of his murder. I think they called him Herbert Pendland or something like that. His name was Harold Pendland. And they didn't even make the connection to Willie Nelson for 2 or 3 days after his murder. And I don't know, you can never tell if the Oregonian is just incompetent or if they're covering things up. You know what I'm talking about?
I have a hint of it, yes. No, yeah, and you don't know. I mean, and in fact, newspaper reporters usually don't know, and especially if they're covering things like this, don't know anything that they don't get from the cops anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
So, which explains a lot of goes a long way to explain why what we're doing, you and I and some others, having to go back, 25 years later or more and find out what really happened.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of interesting that you can go back and find out what really happened. And
well, in Willie Nelson's case, excuse me, nothing, as far as I know, was ever written in the papers or any place else publicly about how he was working the whole time hand in gloves with the narcotics cops. He was protected.
Yeah,
you couldn't go there. No.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can go back and you can chronicle his crimes because they're all reported in the newspaper. The night that some cops showed up at a rowdy party that he was involved with up in North Portland, and they beat the cops up and threw him down the stairs, that's in the newspaper. The night that he tried to kill Don Dupay at a traffic stop, and Don even fired his weapon at him as he ran away, that's in the newspaper too. But nothing ever connects any of these things to, nobody ever mentions that Willie Nelson is doing all these things and always getting away with it. Why is this guy able to do this stuff? And it was kind of fun to be able to put that all together and kind of fill in some of the blanks that are there. So to me, that's what it's really about, is filling in the blanks. Because like you say, a reporter, when the reporter showed up at the house where Willie was murdered, he had no idea who this guy was, but somebody who had been around for a few years definitely would have, because Willie was big in the newspapers in the 50s and the early 60s. A lot of people knew who he was then, but by 1983, when he died, nobody really remembered who he was. And that was on purpose.
Well, that was, his name had surfaced in the trial of the Pigpen, the outsider, which was just a year or two before that.
Yeah.
But even then, that's one of the reasons they had to limit this investigation.
Yeah.
And they had to give all these guys a free pass.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't go there to this essential corruption.
Yeah.
In the police bureau.
Yeah.
And it was. It was one of those unspoken things. Another character who was certainly protected was Tom Johnson.
Yes, and I did quite a lot on him.
Yeah, and that's another great chapter with a considerable amount of new information.
Yes.
And what an amazing character he was.
He really was. And you said that you, when you were writing your book, you gained some respect for some of these bad guys that you were writing about. And Tom Johnson is one that I did that with. I gained a lot of respect for this man. He came to a city that would not accept him, and he made a place for himself, and he was accepted. But he did it based on illegal activity. So I guess that's the way you make it here in Portland, right?
Well, if it's in the 1920s and you're black,
yeah,
that's the only way. That's the only way.
Absolutely right.
And
there was a lot of new information in that chapter. I went to Seattle to the National Archive, and I read the Prohibition Department's investigation of Tom Johnson's operation. And I'm positive, looking at it, I had to take the staples out of some documents so I could scan it. And I know that nobody had looked at that since probably 1932. So that's 80 years or so, nobody had even seen this information. So it's all brand new. And it really put together some things. Like, I knew that Bobby Evans, who I call the official bootlegger of Portland in the 20s, I knew that in 1932, he had gone to war with somebody and tried to take over an operation, but I didn't know whose operation that was until I read this report. And it turns out it was Tom Johnson. So Johnson had to fight for his life in 1932, and he won. Because he was still around and Bobby Evans was not. And by the 50s, Tom Johnson was a well-respected character and kind of a Portland figure that you couldn't get away from. I remember even when I was a kid, Mr. Johnson was somebody that people talked about, and especially his habit of going to the New Republic Cafe in Old Town, Chinatown, and buying the whole menu. He would just order the whole menu and have these huge Chinese meals that everybody could eat. So he was kind of a legendary character when I was a kid. So it was fun to get into that.
You referred to him as respectable, respected, and indeed he was. But he was in the 50s.
Yes.
Still running the rackets.
He was.
Yes. Town. That's
yes, he was.
He had a real estate office, and you go through the door, and there's the saloon. I forget the name.
The Keystone.
And
Keystone Investments on the Keystone Club in the back. Yes. Yeah, it's a great story. And some of the things that I uncovered about him are just amazing. Like the fact that at one point he had, I think it's 70 music venues that he was managing in town. And with him and his wife and Emmanuel Green, they had this huge real estate empire. They owned hundreds of properties all over the city. And if you were a black person and you wanted to go into business or you needed a place to live, it was about the only place that you could go to find someplace was the Keystone Investments and Tom Johnson's organization. And then Emmanuel Green in the background is buying up all these valuable properties that eventually became the, Emmanuel Hospital and the Memorial Coliseum and all those. And those are the dirty deals that came out in the 50s. So, by then, really, Mr. Johnson had pretty much left town. He was living out in Dallasport mostly at that point. But his operation was being run by some pretty good people who were handling it pretty well. But I love it.
Yeah, he was remarkable. He had a ranch out in Central Oregon where he raised Arabian horses.
Yep. He had another ranch out in Vernonia where he also raised horses. This is the thing that made me come to admire Tom Johnson, is he had priorities from the earliest parts of his life. And those priorities were music, horses, and beautiful young women. And he created a life for himself where he could indulge those. And that's what he did.
He was a remarkably capable person.
Yes.
And so it's no wonder that you chose him.
He was one of my favorites.
Gary Gilmore. How and why did you choose Gary Gilmore?
Gary Gilmore. This is another one that's your fault, because I had heard that Gary Gilmore was from Portland, but I didn't really know anything about it until you gave me a copy of that book, Shot in the Heart by Michael Gilmore, that talks about Gilmore's early life. It's a great book. And of course, I read Norm Mailer's Executioner Song, which also is a great book. So I've always had, and I was also, when Gilmore was executed, I was just about to turn 16 years old. So it was a really kind of important turning point for me. And he was an important character in my life because he became kind of an iconic figure in the late 70s after his execution. And so I've always had a kind of a fascination, and I wanted to know, so was he really from Portland? What did he do in Portland? And so I looked it up, and Michael Gilmore gets into some of it in his book, but he didn't really know his brother at that time because he was, what, 8 or 10 years old and didn't really know all of the things that his brother was involved with. He only got to know him later in life. So it was interesting to go back and document that. And I did. I found the crimes that he was involved with, and it's fascinating. And he was also, Gilmore was somebody who always gamed the system. If he could get an advantage from the system, he would play it for all he could get. And he always did that through his whole life, including his execution might have been his way to commit suicide by doing that. But at one point, he claimed that he was committing these crimes because he was insane, and they sent him to Dimash Hospital. And I immediately made the connection with McMurphy from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now, Ken Casey wrote that book before anybody knew who Gary Gilmore was, but he could have based that character on Gary Gilmore himself. It's in the story.
Gary Gilmore could have based his character.
Oh, and that I hadn't even considered that, but you're right.
Oh, of course, these guys do a lot of reading.
Oh, I bet he did.
And Gilmore and his brothers. Take Michael for example. They're very smart people.
Yes.
And Gary Gilmore was a talented artist too.
Yes, he was.
So, yeah. But he was. They were brutalized by their father.
Yes.
And as you know, it's not surprising that he lashed out against the world and continued to the very end.
Yeah. And one of the things I'm proud of in the book is I have the high school yearbook pictures of the 3 Gilmore brothers who all started as freshmen at Franklin High School the same year. And I think of those poor teachers who had to deal with those 3 hoodlums. That could not have been fun. Because at that point, Gilmore was already doing burglaries. He was trying to find weapons that he could take downtown so he could join the Broadway gang. That was another thing that I really enjoyed about writing that Gilmore chapter is I searched out the Broadway gang and tried to get to the real truth about what that was. Because the Broadway gang is kind of a myth that grew up in Portland in the 50s, but there were a lot of young toughs who were hanging out on Broadway and committing a lot of crimes. So it's a myth that's based on a real story. And it was fun to kind of get at that. And especially when I saw the big story, I think it's 1952 when they or 51, when they arrested the burglar and they solved like 100 cases over the last year, 100 burglaries. And then they did a big spread in the Oregonian. And I thought, okay, so Gary Gilmore's 12 years old, delivering the Oregonian, and he sees this story, and he set his life goals to be this hoodlum that he idolized in the paper. And it's kind of fascinating to see what he did with that. And a real wasted life, because like you say, he was a very intelligent man and had a lot of artistic ability, but he really wasted it with what he did. So it's a story that I'm really connected to in some ways. And I liked writing it a lot.
Yeah, it was you could tell it was very well told. He deserves to be there simply because he was the first person executed in the United States after a period when the death penalty was had been decreed illegal, so or off the books. So I don't know how much more time we have left, but I did want to ask you a question that I always I have to deal with a lot. Why do you think people like you and maybe some others are fascinated by this sort of thing? I mean, and it's not just the writers. There's obviously a huge audience for it too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. these stories are fascinating to audiences, even if the crooks don't come to a bad end.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes even better. Think of DB Cooper. If he had been caught, people would probably not pay any attention to this guy. But the fact that he maybe got away with it leaves
people admire it. Yeah,
exactly. It leaves a sense of mystery, a sense of excitement in some ways. I don't know why they're so fascinating, but I sure know that they are. And I probably won't give up on it because there's still a lot of stories I've got to tell.
And there are a lot of them out there.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thanks very much for joining us today. I really appreciate talking with you about your books, Rose City Vice and Portland Confidential, and your Murder in Oregon Season 1 podcast, the new podcast you're doing. And of course, thanks very much for reading my book and talking to me about it. I appreciate your time today, Phil.
It's a great book. I hope a lot of people buy it.
Thank you. I do too.
I joined Toastmasters to improve my speaking, listening, communication, and leadership skills.
Toastmasters gave me
incredible confidence,
great listening skills,
poise,
great leadership skills,
the ability to speak in public,
strength, a captive audience,
quality feedback from the more experienced Toastmasters.
Toastmasters really helped me improve my listening skills.
sales skills,
opportunities to go to different groups and widen my whole horizon.
Toastmasters has given me a more focused me, and I'm a much better listener. Toastmasters is fulfilling.
It's a great place to fail your way to success.
Wonderful way to meet people.
networking,
Strength. It's addictive.
It's a club of self-improvement.
It's an experience, it's a ride that you won't forget, and you'll enjoy it every step of the way.
Toastmasters helped me land a kick-butt job. I sang at one of my table topic speeches, and people liked it and applauded.
My business is doing great, and I'm very, very grateful to Toastmasters.
It's been a great experience for me.
Thank you, Toastmasters.
Thank you, Toastmasters.
Thank you, Toastmasters, for giving me so much confidence.
thank you Toastmasters for everything.